during the Vietnam conflict, the sides were so polarized that we came very close to a civil conflict intensified by the black insurrections across our urban ghettos. And at this point, there was a typical Machiavellian effort to rally a new center carried out by a group of bankers, diplomats, and generals chosen by the president and called the Wise Men, who tried to counsel Lyndon Johnson that he should get out of Vietnam and deal with the problems at home in order to stabilize America. It was not a moral argument, it was a Machiavellian argument. Johnson was forced as a result out of office, and eventually the Wise Men gathered a new center coalition in which the McCarthy campaign, the Kennedy campaigns were part of the new center. A new generation of black and Latino and Asian and women's leadership and environmentalists came on the scene, reforming of the Democratic Party. But the real objective of the 60s, which was to end the Cold War and empower Americans who had been marginalized and discriminated against, was blocked by the counter movement that came very swiftly after the end of the Vietnam War, that elected Ronald Reagan president, launched the new crusade called the Central American Wars, dismantled as much as possible of the New Deal model, and ushered in the generation of people that we now know as the neoconservatives. What happens is the conservative counter movement inevitably goes too far and it reignites a movement response, which is what you're seeing in Wisconsin. And so it was with the stolen election of 2000, which installed George Bush as president illegitimately, instead of Al Gore, who as president would have tested the possibilities of an environmental presidency. We'll never know. The resentment of Bush and the theft of that election, as perceived by millions of people, added fuel to the suspicions surrounding Iraq, which ignited memories of Vietnam and exploded suddenly in the largest global peace movement ever seen in February 2003. It's well worth remembering what happened between 2003 and 2008. There were more than 10 demonstrations of over 100,000 people, some 300,000, 400,000. Public opinion came to view the Iraq War as a mistake more rapidly than public opinion turned against Vietnam. 165 cities came out for peace. The new counterculture produced giants like Michael Moore, and the underground press of the 60s was succeeded by the independent media, with heroines like Amy Goodman. Howard Dean came out of nowhere to oppose the Democratic establishment over Iraq. Online organizations like MoveOn arose spontaneously, raising tens of millions of dollars for Dean. In 2006, Iraq became a central issue and American voters dumped a Republican Congress. In 2008, Barack Obama not only realized the dream of a generation of civil rights advocates, he got to the presidency in part by opposing the Iraq War in Iowa and the other primaries, and so became the first president elected with such support from an anti-war movement. So in a 5-year, 6-year period, the movement came mysteriously from the margins to the mainstream as a controlling factor in national politics. Well, you probably are saying, well, that was then. What about now? The underlying movement in Iraq and Afghanistan of the past 20 years, I think is similar to the early civil rights movements or the slave resistance movements of long ago, because it's based on a strong current of anti-colonialism and nationalism, secular and spiritual, across the Muslim world in response to the long domination of the West. Suicide bombers would be an extreme flank of this movement against military occupation. They're not an independent, unexplainable variable. And Arab nationalism of the Nasser or Saddam Hussein variety is a spent force, but now is arising again in a younger generation that is partly nationalist and partly part of the new media conscious generation symbolized by Al Jazeera. Anti-war movement in the United States, I think, arises partly as the legacy of memory about Iraq and Vietnam, but also typically as a moral response to the suffering or a political response to the U.S. casualties and taxpayer costs, the appearance of quagmire, the seeming futility of military solutions, and the diversion of tax dollars away from our pressing economic needs at home. It is very important to remember that the American people will pay a heavy cost for a war that they think is worth fighting. So it's the lack of public support, including moral support, for these wars that indicates we've come to a turning point in which the public has no particular interest in shedding blood or tax dollars anymore. The moderates have been lost from the control of the right. The rank and file of the peace movement has become the rank and file of the majority. The most extreme Machiavellians are either the neoconservatives, who we don't hear about much anymore, but they're still there, who are really at war with what they call Islamofascism, or the traditional militarists, conservatives, who may seem less extreme, but they favor a Pax Americana abroad, the protection of oil resources, a safe environment for corporate investment and trade, and the status quo at home reinforced, if necessary, by monitoring harassment and indictments of anti-war activists, particularly from the Muslim community, who are now being targeted by Peter King's congressional hearing starting this week. The traditional Machiavellians, on the other hand, are less inspired and passionate than the neocons. They are businessmen of sorts, and they will cut their losses when necessary. Other moderates, including President Obama, are dedicated to preserving the civil rights and other domestic gains of social movements of the past that brought them to power, reducing the costs and exposure of the long war, and projecting a greater emphasis on diplomacy and reform in foreign policy. Like John Kennedy, however, they tend to want to promote an image of toughness in national security and employ special forces where need be. In 2008, the Obama campaign succeeded in making a temporary bridge with the peace movement over the question of ending the Iraq War. But for other reasons, Obama promised to continue the war in Afghanistan and counterterrorism against al-Qaeda, primarily for Machiavellian reasons, the protection of the sovereignty and the reputation of the state. But I think the idea of spending $1 trillion on a long war in Afghanistan has become extremely precarious because of budget cuts, deficits, and the long recession. While many in the Pentagon and the neoconservative world would want to continue the long war forever, regardless of cost and duration, others in the foreign policy establishment and even the White House are struggling to find an exit strategy that rapidly draws down costs and casualties so that funds can be transferred to the domestic side of our national agenda. Most of the anti-war movement, in the broad sense, not the organized activists, the Democratic rank and file, the progressives, the minorities, the Hollywood funders, are contained under the limits of the Obama coalition and preoccupied with the Great Recession and the rise of the Tea Party counter-movement. They will support Obama next time, no question. They share many of the concerns of the moderate Machiavellians against the extreme. But as we know, there is a great restlessness in their ranks over the economy and the drain of the quagmires in Afghanistan and Pakistan. The passage of Barbara Lee's anti-war resolution at the Democratic National Committee sends a message that the Democrats as a whole are turning against the war policy, if not the president. Recent polls show that 73% of Democrats favor a troop withdrawal deadline of 1 year, and 86% of Democrats favor a more rapid withdrawal than the president has offered. A majority of all voters now favor a 1-year withdrawal, which is up 9% from September. So President Obama, if he chooses, should be able to begin significant troop withdrawals this year and call for the transfer of billions of dollars to address our problems at home. For example, 55% of Americans prefer that he cut the military budget against only 21% who say he should cut Medicare and 13% who say he should cut Social Security. Obama should be able, therefore, to create a coalition between the mainstream of public opinion and the more prudent Machiavellians that he represents, to campaign on a pledge of ending these wars instead of ending up in two quagmires during a recession in 2012. We shall see. The president is caught between the social movements that helped elect him and the Machiavellians of Wall Street and the military. The role of the peace movement, I think, is to exercise a pull on the rank and file of those constituencies that the president needs to worry about in 2012. That is, the grassroots peace movement now has to build local coalitions, organic coalitions, linking the war to the economy. And domestic reformers like unions on the other side need to realize there is no other source of funding to meet their needs, their economic needs, except the $159 billion that goes annually for Afghanistan and Iraq. Obama seems to understand the predicament. He's quoted in Bob Woodward's book as follows, quote, "We're going to start leaving," he says, "we're going to start leaving Afghanistan. Quote, I can't lose the whole Democratic Party." We shall see.